Let's dive into a really fascinating moment in history. What happened when the French Revolution, this absolute tidal wave of liberty and violence, crashed onto British shores, just across the Channel? It sparked hope, it sparked paranoia, and it led to one of the most severe government crackdowns on civil liberties the nation had ever seen. And it forced Britain to confront a really powerful question. Right. This is the question that's really at the heart of our whole story. You see, for Britain in the 1790s, those famous ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity sounded pretty inspiring at first. But very quickly, they started to look like a dangerous contagion. So how did a nation that prided itself on its own revolutionary past end up seeing liberty itself as a massive threat? Okay, so to really get the British reaction, you first have to understand the sheer speed and, frankly, the violence of what was happening in France. It all kicks off in 1789 with the storming of the Bastille, a huge symbolic blow against the monarchy. By 1791, the king's power is pretty much gone. But then, the pace just accelerates brutally. In January 1793, King Louis XVI is publicly executed. And just 2 months after that, the infamous Reign of Terror begins. In Paris alone, 1,400 people were sent to the guillotine in just 6 weeks. I mean, just think about that. This was the terrifying backdrop Britain was watching unfold. Now, you'd probably expect this news to be met with just pure horror in Britain, right? But that is not what happened, at least not at first. Initially, the reaction was overwhelmingly positive. It felt like history was repeating itself. But this time, it was for the French. And look, this wasn't just some fringe opinion. This sentiment was widespread. A lot of people in Britain saw the fall of the Bastille as France finally catching up, following the path of Britain's own glorious revolution from a century earlier. For a brief moment, it really seemed like a victory for liberty everywhere. This wave of optimism didn't just stop at the English Channel. It sparked real hope for change at home. British reformers saw this as the perfect moment to push for their own demands. Things like expanding voting rights and getting rid of the corrupt, rotten boroughs, which were basically parliamentary seats that could be bought and sold. And you know what's wild? Even the establishment seemed to be on board, at least a little. Prime Minister William Pitt fully expected France to just settle into a stable, constitutional monarchy. And even King George III himself admitted that the French king's absolute power probably needed to be checked. But as the revolution in France got more and more radical, more violent, that hopeful dawn in Britain quickly turned into a dark and stormy night. Optimism completely soured and became this nationwide panic as these radical ideas really started to take root. And this is where things really heat up. This shift kicks off what's now known as the Revolution controversy, basically an all-out intellectual war fought with pamphlets. The brightest minds in Britain were arguing over the very nature of rights, of government, of society. One historian even called it perhaps the last real discussion of the fundamentals of politics the nation would ever have. At the absolute center of this firestorm were two intellectual heavyweights. On one side, you had Edmund Burke. He totally shocked everyone by breaking with his liberal friends to defend the French aristocracy and the monarchy. And on the other side, you had Thomas Paine. His fiery pamphlet, The Rights of Man, became the absolute Bible for radical movements. It championed republicanism and individual liberty. Their opposing views basically defined the two sides of a deeply, deeply divided nation. And crucially, these ideas didn't just stay on the page, they jumped right into the streets. Inspired by Paine, dozens of these reform clubs just sprang up all over the country. We're not talking about a bunch of elites in a fancy room here. These clubs were filled with skilled artisans and craftsmen, and they were demanding a government based on the rights of man. By the mid-1790s, there were about 80 of these societies, and you can bet the government was starting to get very, very nervous. So, as that fear grew, the establishment found an incredibly powerful weapon to fight back: propaganda. Political cartoons in particular became this crucial tool for turning public opinion against the reformers, painting them as dangerous, treasonous traitors who wanted to bring all the chaos of France right to Britain's doorstep. And to give you a taste of just how nasty this got, check out this quote. It's from a famous and, frankly, pretty shocking cartoon by James Gilray. It perfectly captures the political temperature. It shows leading reformers mock-executing King George III, who's drawn as this sort of dim-witted fool, completely oblivious to his own danger. It just goes to show you not only how reformers were being demonized, but how high the stakes were getting. Nobody was off limits. This rising tide of radicalism and all this public agitation, well, it pushed the government of William Pitt the Younger right to a breaking point. He was convinced that Britain was on the verge of its own bloody revolution, so he decided to strike back, and strike back hard. So what exactly was the government so afraid of? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was a whole cocktail of fears. The biggest one, of course, was a full-blown British Revolution. But they were also terrified of a French invasion, of radical ideas causing widespread unrest, and of the economic chaos that a war could bring. Faced with all this, Pitt felt he had no choice but to act, and act decisively. And act he did. Over the next few years, Pitt's government passed a whole series of laws designed to just systematically crush the reform movement. The Aliens Act was meant to block potential French spies. Habeas corpus, the fundamental right to a trial, was suspended. They even redefined treason to include not just actions, but even speaking or writing against the king. Public meetings were pretty much banned, and finally, trade unions were made completely illegal. This was a full-scale assault on civil liberties. So you might be thinking, okay, this seems extreme. Why? Well, this number right here tells you a lot. By 1795, the London Corresponding Society alone had around 5,000 members. Now, to a government that was already on edge, this didn't look like a debating club. This looked like the seed of a revolutionary army growing right in the heart of the capital. And this all leads us to the great historical debate. Was William Pitt a savior who protected Britain from the horrors of revolution, or was he a tyrant who basically implemented his own reign of terror and trampled all over the basic rights of his own people? The arguments on both sides are really compelling. On the one hand, Pitt's supporters point to what they see as success. There was no revolution in Britain, the country wasn't invaded, and the economy held up. But the arguments against him are just as powerful. He suspended basic rights, he created this atmosphere of fear, and in the end, he just drove radicalism underground. Plus, his total failure to deal with the crisis in Ireland led directly to a bloody rebellion in 1798. So in terms of his main goal, preventing a revolution, Pitt's strategy was, you can't deny it, pretty effective. He basically used a three-step playbook. First, legal repression to take apart the radical societies piece by piece. Second, military force to control any unrest. And third, a very successful propaganda war that rallied loyalist support for the monarchy and painted reformers as traitors. But, and this is the key counter-argument, Pitt didn't actually kill the radical movement. He just forced it underground. The ideas of reform and all that anger at the government's oppression, it just festered below the surface, ready to bubble up and erupt again later in the 19th century. So what was the lasting impact of this entire decade of fear? Well, the consequences of Pitt's war on radicalism would go on to shape the future of Britain and Ireland for generations to come. The fallout was huge. That failed Irish rebellion of 1798 led directly to the Act of Union, which formally bound Ireland to Great Britain. But Pitt's failure to grant rights to Catholics as part of that deal, that poisoned Anglo-Irish relations for over a century. And of course, by driving radicalism underground, he just delayed the fight for reform, making sure that social unrest would remain a major feature of British life. Ultimately, the struggle between Pitt's government and the British radicals of the 1790s wasn't really just about the French Revolution. It cemented this fundamental tension that, let's be honest, still exists today. That constant, difficult negotiation between the state's need to keep us secure and the citizens' right to demand freedom. And that leaves us with this final question. Pitt's government believed it was saving the nation by sacrificing liberty. The radicals believed that a nation without liberty wasn't worth saving in the first place. It's a debate that never really ended, and it forces us to ask ourselves, how do we draw that line today?